Good afternoon. Welcome to session number 3 of this first day of the Tandem PV workshop. We already had a wonderful first 2 sessions earlier this afternoon, and now I'm very pleased to chair session number 3, which is on high efficiency perovskite top solar cell for tandems. We will have 2 speakers. First of all, Ashley Marshall, giving us the latest update from the work on wide bandgap perovskite top solar cells for tandem applications from University of Oxford, from the group of Henry Snaith, and after that from Xingtuan Huan from University of North Carolina. He will talk about large area perovskite silicon and perovskite tandem solar cells and modules. So let's start first of all and welcome Ashley Marshall, and we're happy and looking forward to her talk on understanding and achieving high efficiency, high open circuit voltage and stable wide bandgap perovskite top solar cell. Stage is all yours, Ashley.
Great, thank you. Let me just get organized. I'm hoping you can all see my screen okay now. Just switch over to the laser
Perfect.
pointer.
Yes.
Great, thanks. Yeah, so thank you for having me. Professor Henry Snaith sends his apologies for not being able to be with us today, but he is off this week. So I will be presenting some of the recent work in our group in his place. And the title of the talk that he gave me was Understanding and Achieving High Open Circuit Voltage in Stable Wide Bandgap Perovskite Solar Cells. I don't have too much by the way of introduction. I'm assuming that if we're at this conference, we're all well aware of the need for high efficiency photovoltaics and how tandems will help us get there. But I would like to start by thanking, first off, the group members who helped contribute to this talk. So Dr. Suhaus Mahesh, Dr. Yen Hong Lin, Dr. Pietro Caprioglio, and Robbie Oliver, all fellow group members of mine who contributed. They're kind of the first authors on the papers I'll be talking about today and helped me put together all the data and everything for everything I'll be talking to you about. So big thanks to them in advance before we get started. So I'd like to just begin by looking at losses in solar cells. There's been a pretty good introduction, I think, to these topics kind of throughout the afternoon. So thank you to all the speakers before me for setting this up so well. But the few that I'll kind of be focusing on, especially near the end of the talk, are looking at basically these traps. So we have non-radiative recombination through traps in our perovskite, which influences the quasi-Fermi level splitting in the device. This quasi-Fermi level splitting will determine the overall VOC of the devices that we make. And so it's something that's really important, and we can actually measure it before we even fabricate an entire device. So that can be really helpful. So this quasi-Fermi level splitting is influenced by the radiative rate versus the non-radiative rate in our cells. It's also influenced by these charge selective contacts that we use for our solar cells. So those are going to influence that quasi-Fermi level splitting. And then when we put these extraction contacts on, we can also form new traps at the surface. We have some sort of we can make traps here, or there can be a combination happening at those interfaces. And so those also decrease our Fermi level splitting, which will decrease the VOC in our solar cells. And one of the ways we can measure this, this kind of equation was mentioned earlier as well, but it's looking at this external luminescence efficiency of the material that we're using. And this directly influences the VOC that we're going to measure. So these are kind of a few of the things we'll be thinking about, especially later as we try to analyze where these losses are in our solar cells. So looking at wide bandgap perovskites, which will be WBG for the remainder of this talk, if we look at where the band gaps need to be for silicon or CIGS bottom cells, we're right around 1.7. And if we're looking at a perovskite top cell with a perovskite bottom cell, we maybe need to be a bit higher around this 1.8 region. But when we look at the VOC that is attained by a whole array of different perovskite cells, we see that our highest efficiency devices tend to be, this 1.5 to 1.6 EV band gap, and they're getting over 90% of what we would expect from the Shockley-Quasar analysis. But these higher band gap materials are really kind of falling short still. There's been a few publications that maybe, you know, past this 90% limit, but kind of we see mostly this voltage or this VOC pinning basically in our devices. We have kind of a similar problem with the bottom cells if we're looking at lead tin, where we're not getting nearly as much current as we would hope. But for this talk today, we're just going to focus on the wide bandgap cells and the VOC losses there. So another paper graphing the VOC versus the bandgap. This one though has this really interesting region they've pinned out here in gray, where we need to use mixed halide materials in order to achieve these band gaps for our perovskite materials. And as we saw earlier, these mixed halide perovskites have a bit of a stability problem. So we have this photo-induced phase segregation that occurs. And so in addition to having this VOC pinning that we see here, where we're not getting nearly as high VOCs we would expect from the band gaps that we're doing, we're also in this region where we have these mixed halides, and that halide segregation can also lead to decrease in the VOC. When we look at the VOC losses that we see, when we just look at PIN devices and MA-free devices, so our group has kind of almost completely moved away from any sort of MA incorporation into our perovskites because of the thermal stability issues. So most of the things we're doing now are all on FA cesium just to encourage long-term stability. But this problem is still there, and maybe even somewhat worse sometimes when we look at our MA-free PIN devices. So the things I want to talk about today, the challenges of wide bandgap devices. We have a bit lower efficiency than we would want because of this high VOC deficit. And then we have the stability problem with the halide segregation. So one of the questions that we'll first try to answer is how strongly are these two things linked? So if we could completely solve the problem of halide segregation, would we fix this VOC deficit? Would that just completely fix all our problems? And so we'll start with some work from Dr. Suhas Mahesh, which was published last year, if you'd like to look at his paper. So he looks at why do we have this voltage pinning in general to begin with. So to set up some of the modeling that he did, we can look at how he calculated the VOC. And here he uses this equation where we look at the ratio of the short circuit current to the dark recombination current. I think we're all familiar with how you would calculate a short circuit current, integrating your EQE versus the solar spectrum. Anyone who's made a solar cell and measured the EQE has probably done that, if not by hand, then with some software. But then when we look at calculating this J naught, this dark recombination current, the integral that we use here is the EQE once again, but instead of the solar spectrum, we're going to use black body photon flux density graphed here in red. And when we integrate over the incident black body flux, as shown here in red, what we see is that as we go to lower and lower wavelengths, this red curve increases exponentially, which means that all of our this tail in our EQE is going to influence this J naught a lot. And so while this might not influence our JSC that we measure, like how steep this onset is, or where exactly this onset starts, it does influence this J naught quite drastically. And so when we're looking at this ratio, it ends up with a lot lower VOC if we have a very large dark recombination current. in reality, in the model, we do some adjustments based on the radiative versus non-radiative rates as well. So if you want the full details of that, you can go look at his paper. But overall, kind of takeaway from this piece is that our VOC is highly sensitive to the shape of this absorption tail. So when we move on to the modeling, the modeling that Suhas has done was using the effective medium approximation. So we measure N and K values using ellipsometry, using a generalized transfer matrix model along with the detailed balance calculation to figure out our VOC. And the way we wanted to look at halide segregation in these materials, Suhaus modeled the EQE of a cell based on how much halide segregation maybe had occurred. So we graph this as kind of this percentage of the minority phase. So that would be the kind of lower band gap phase that is segregating out from our perovskite. And this bump or tail can cause a large increase in the J naught, which will decrease our VOC. So if we do this kind of modeling to calculate what kind of the radiative limit for our VOC based on how much of the minority phase has segregated out, then we see that for the lower band gap materials, this phase segregation isn't too much of a problem, right? We can get to 10% of this minority phase without having a real impact on our VOC really at all. But as we go to higher and higher band gaps, this, with the higher and higher bromide content, this phase segregation with this extra bump in the EQE ends up influencing the VOC that we can get, this radiative limit for our VOC, quite drastically, even at very low kind of percentages of this minority phase. And so when we start to think about these wide band gap cells that we want to use in tandems, even 0.1 to 1% might have a big impact on the VOC with this halide segregation problem. So does this match what we see in actual devices? So if we can use a very sensitive EQE measurement, so we can actually see these low band gap states growing in the EQE and some modeling, we can decouple basically our segregation losses in devices from any kind of other losses that we have for our VOC. And so if we put in this case, I'm pretty sure they were MAFA devices with iodide bromide mixtures. If we have that exposed to light, we can see pretty drastic halide segregation showing up even within 10, 20 minutes. And if we leave that cell in the dark, it takes a really long time to recover. So we can basically use this information, one, to calculate our VOC loss, but two, also to figure out how much of that phase, that lower energy phase, has been segregating out. So in this case, we see that we have about 1% of the overall perovskite that's in this lower energy, this lower band gap phase. And there's some analysis too on the Urbach tails here that seems to suggest that we don't completely phase segregate, right? There's some that's completely phase segregated, but then also there are just a whole array of different compositions kind of moving between these two states of how much iodide might be in there. So if we calculate, we can calculate how much VOC loss we would expect from the segregation, which ends up in this case to be about 120 millivolts. But if we compare that to the VOC in the radiative limit that we would expect based on compared to what we measure in our actual devices, we actually see that our non-radiative losses are more like 450 millivolts. So segregation definitely influences our VOC and causes a drop in VOC over time. But these non-radiative losses are actually much more important and would actually give us a much bigger VOC boost compared to just working on trying to stabilize the halide segregation that we're seeing. So speaking of stability, we'll next move on to Yen's paper, which was the addition of this piperidinium salt into the FA-cesium perovskite in order for really good long-term stability. So this piperidinium additive showed improved device performance across multiple device parameters, um, which is great. And it was also tested on a 90-10 iodide to bromide mixture and the 77-23 iodide to bromide mixture. And it improves the performance of both of those compositions. So that's really neat. This piperidinium salt, I should say, is mixed into the perovskite solution before spin coating. So it's not like a top treatment. It's actually mixed into the perovskite solution before it's deposited. But we see this improvement basically in the overall efficiency, which is great. But the really neat thing about this additive is that we get really good stability of the perovskite material. So if we look here, just a control device, these are just PIN devices with the FA cesium. We can see how the control device, especially unencapsulated control devices, die fairly quickly. And this is just at 60 degrees, so we're not even at 85 yet, versus the perovskite with the piperidinium added in actually have this really good stability over time. So that was really neat to see. And then if we look at the SIMS measurement down here, this is tracking the fluorine signal. We don't see that the piperidinium salt is like really well mixed into the perovskite. We see like these regions for the fluorine signal, which makes us think that the piperidinium additive is actually just on the grain boundaries and not actually, mixing in really homogeneously into the film. So looking at the degradation pathways that this piperidinium salt is helping to suppress, we can look at the XRD pattern as the films are exposed to light for hundreds of hours. And one of the things we see is that we see the secondary FAPB-BR3 phase that's growing in. We see that after, within this 360-hour time frame for just a neat film. But with the ionic additive in there, that phase starts to grow in slightly, but not nearly as early as with the control film. We also see the appearance of this lead iodide peak fairly early on with the control versus with the piperidinium salt added, it's not growing in. We also see that corroborated with the UV-vis absorption spectra, where in the control sample, we kind of lose that nice sharp absorption onset fairly early on in the aging process, and we see this red shift of the material. And you might be thinking, why is it shifting red if we're forming this FAPB-BR3? That should be a higher band gap. You're right. But if this is phase segregating out of a kind of the bulk of the material, we're taking kind of a wider band gap material out, so we see this kind of shift. Also, we kind of just lose the onset of the absorption spectra compared to the piperidinium, where we have good stability, and it takes a lot longer before we start to see any red shifting, just based on the absorption. So one of the things that next was related to pinholes. So if we take just lead iodide and expose it to light at elevated temperatures, you start seeing pinholes in the film. In XRD, you can start seeing metallic lead. And so you would assume from just the lead iodide type films that then you're losing I2. So he looked at figuring out, is that actually happening in the perovskite film, or is that just something that happens with lead iodide? And in this experiment, the perovskite films were put into a sealed vial filled with toluene, and then they were exposed to light. And if we look at just even visually these perovskite films in toluene versus the control after light exposure, this one looks very like brownish, kind of maybe a little bit purpley, and that's just from the I2 that's being released into the toluene. So we can track this peak at 500, um, looking at how much I2 gas is released kind of over time. And with this ionic additive added in, we have just much slower and less degradation overall based on this release of the I2. So that's really neat. We've got really good stability from this ionic additive, which also increased our overall kind of device performance. But then we had this question next of, can an ionic additive improve even wider band gap perovskite materials as well? And this is some work from Pietro and Robbie, which is about to be submitted. So you get a sneak peek, sneak preview today. So they're working on a Fa83 cesium 17 lead iodide 60 bromide 40. Those numbers might be a little hard to see on your screen, depending on how small the video is. But and using this ionic additive, and they also saw really good device improvement overall by using this ionic additive. So here we have, our control device is in gray, the ionic additive is in pink, and then the recently popular lithium fluoride, which we'll talk a bit more about on the next slide, also improves device performance overall. And one of the things I want to highlight is they get this really big boost in the VOC when they use this ionic additive. And from the EQE spectra, we can see that we just have better kind of charge extraction over all wavelengths, better response. And so looking at actually analyzing kind of where these VOC gains are coming from, we use PLQY to determine or calculate the quasi-Fermi level splitting that we see in the films. So in this case, we have just the neat perovskite on glass, and then it also with the charge selective contact layers, as you can see here, and then with and without the ionic additive. So we get a bit of a boost in the PLQY, or better quasi-Fermi level splitting with the ionic additive. And that effect is even more drastic actually with the contact layers. So kind of two things to pull from this graph. First off, both of our interfaces on both sides of our PIN device for these wide band gap materials are slightly quenching. So we get slightly worse quasi-Fermi level splitting when we use them. But this ionic additive seems to be helping to slightly passivate those interfaces. So if we do kind of a full analysis of our recombination in this case, we have, so here we have, this is by using the PLQY as a function of flux, we can extract a JV curve of what we would expect for just the pure material. So this is just a neat Fa cesium film. The JV curve has been simulated using the data collected from the PL as a function of flux. So going from kind of this black curve to this darker gray, this purple kind of shading in between, then we're looking at the simulated JV curve, or this pseudo JV curve, when we have the contact layers deposited, so doing the PL dependence with the contact layers deposited, and then compared to gray here is the actual device. So if we look at how our V changes different measurements, this blue box here is going to represent how much bulk recombination loss we have. So that's going to be, any of that non-radiative recombination that's happening just within the material itself is kind of this loss between this red line, which is our radiative limit of our VOC compared to the triangle. And then this pink box represents our interfacial recombination losses. And then anything we lose beyond that, so measuring a real solar cell as opposed to simulating the JV curve, we can assume is some energetic misalignment between our contact layers that we're using. So with our ionic additive, we can see a real decrease in the overall kind of non-radiative recombination loss that we have. And there's some loss, or we decrease the amount of interfacial recombination losses as well. And the lithium fluoride helps with that interfacial recombination, and also a bit with the fill factor. So you'll have to wait in anticipation for their paper to read all about that. But we are not quite sure on the working mechanisms yet. One thing that was interesting is that if you look at the overall device performance, we do see a boost in the VOC, but we also see a boost in the JSC, which we haven't been able to readily explain yet. I think it's clear that the VOC gains are coming from improved material and improved contact layers. So we're still kind of looking at that. So one thing to end on before I conclude is looking at wide bandgap perovskites without any additives yet. They'll probably be coming very soon. But my project focuses on kind of the inorganic perovskites. So instead of starting from mostly Fa, starting from mostly cesium, and in this case, adding in dimethyl ammonium in order to stabilize the cesium lead iodide material. You see a bit of a VOC drop by adding the dimethyl ammonium. This drops the band gap just slightly, but we see a bit more of a VOC loss than maybe we would expect from just a band gap change. And in this case, we think that's maybe a material quality. But the ability to put dimethyl ammonium into the A site actually opens up a whole new compositional range to explore for these wide bandgap materials. So you can see here we've just done it with the triple iodide, but if we start kind of mixing iodide and bromide, we can get fairly high VOC with some of these new compositions. And this is before doing any sort of additives or treatments. So that's really, really exciting. So to conclude, in order to improve the wide bandgap perovskites in general, we really need to focus on reducing this non-radiative recombination. So really making just better materials to start with. There's also been suggestions that if we improve this, if we improve our radiative recombination, then the halide segregation actually gets better. So we get less halide segregation. And yeah, we're excited to look at more compositions to explore for these wide bandgap materials to make, 2-junction or 3-junction kind of tandem solar cells, whether that's all perovskites or silicon on perovskite. So a big thank you once again to Suhaus, Yen, Robbie, and Pietro, who is not in this picture yet, because this was a group picture from a while ago when we could all stand next to each other. And all of our collaborators. We have an amazing group of collaborators we get to work with at Oxford and really just around the world, doing great science and amazing conversations. And then, thank you to all of the people who fund the different parts of our research group that allow us to do the science that we do every day. And with that, I would love to answer any questions.
Thanks a lot, Ashley. Wonderful talk. Thanks a lot for sharing these latest results. Also, some unpublished data. That's always appreciated to keep the workshop up to date. A big applause. Yeah, I share the virtual applause, so to say, here. There's a couple of questions, and I'm happy to read out a few of them. I might have to make a selection. So the first question from Jan Keller addresses the first part of your presentation, and this was about the segregation-induced VOC loss. The question is whether you investigated the effect of the location of the segregated phase on VOC. So any local investigation of the phase segregation and the relation to the VOC.
So not that I'm aware of. I don't know that we're able to actually measure where that might be in our actual devices. And I don't think that the model takes into account where that segregation might be. I think it kind of assumes some sort of homogeneity as far as the different kind of components are there.
I personally, I also wasn't quite sure if the initial formula on the dark saturation current can be that simply expanded for that scenario, but still, it's of course a valid
Mhm.
assumption, or the best we can do.
Yeah, I think it would get much more difficult. We'd have to rethink like how we're drawing all the band diagrams of how we're modeling all of it. I think in order to put some sort of location information into that model.
Then there's another question from Amran Al-Ashuri on the second part, so the piperidinium salts. Two questions, or two related questions here. On the one hand side, he asks for some tricks. Yeah, any tricks that you apply, or is it straightforward and an additive that you add straightforward to the composition? And second, also, could you describe in a nutshell how you believe the working principle of this additive is and how it improves the stability?
Yeah, so for the first part, it's fairly straightforward. I think with spin coating, there's always tricks, right? So thinking about solvent atmosphere, we do all of our spin coating, well, for some of these materials, in a glove box. And so thinking about airflow and during the spin coating process and when you do the anti-solvent quench and all of that, I would say there's probably more tricks associated with that than mixing in the piperidinium salt. Um, and as far as the second part goes, um, as far as I'm aware, the kind of working principle is that because we think it's sitting at these grain boundaries, we're able to kind of passivate any um, you could say like missing sites at the surface. So if you think about having your perovskite crystal, um, and we like to think about it as a bulk crystal structure, but as soon as you get to an edge, there's going to be somewhere where that crystal has to be cut, right? So you're either going to be it's going to either look halide deficient or A site cation deficient or maybe lead deficient. So I think that kind of both pieces of that piperidinium salt can help passivate at those surfaces where you're going to have any of those, dangling bonds or anything like that. Um, as far as, and I think that can just help stabilize the perovskite overall. Um, as far as like the specifics of how that goes, I don't know if I have any more any more comments on that bit.
So it's really this passivation and this improved stability of the bulk that you believe is the working principle, and not just making the layer hydrophobic or similar. Yeah.
Yeah, no, I think it has to do something.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Thanks a lot. There's a couple of more questions, and I would appreciate if you could take the time afterwards and also answer those directly in the chat. Due to time, we have to proceed.